At the very end of the book of Exodus, something strange happens. The tabernacle, this incredible portable sanctuary for God's presence, is finally finished. And then God's glorious presence, a pillar of cloud and fire, descends and fills it so powerfully that the Bible says Moses himself can't get in. So, we've got a problem, right? If Moses, the leader of Israel and God's chosen prophet, can't enter God's presence, how on earth is an entire nation of sinful, rebellious people supposed to live alongside a perfectly holy God? This is more than just a logistical issue. It's a full-blown theological crisis. And the answer, the divine instruction manual for resolving this crisis, is the book of Leviticus. Now for many people, Leviticus is where their Bible-in-a-year reading plan goes to die. It can feel like a dense, ancient, and frankly weird collection of laws about sacrifices, skin diseases, and bodily functions. But if that's all we see, we're missing the entire point. Leviticus isn't just a rule book, it's a revolutionary guide explaining how God graciously makes a way for imperfect people to be reconciled to Him and live in His holy presence. This video is our guide to that guide. We're going to unpack its brilliant theology, its historical setting, and its story to show you how this ancient book shaped Israel's relationship with God and still shapes our understanding of faith today. So how can sinful people live in the presence of a holy God without being destroyed? That is the question Leviticus was written to answer. It's a book about grace, justice, and reconciliation. Before we get to the sacrifices and laws, we have to understand the world of Leviticus. The story picks up with the Israelites camped at the foot of Mount Sinai. Scholars generally place this sometime between the 15th and 13th centuries BCE. They've just escaped slavery in Egypt, received the Ten Commandments, and built the tabernacle. This is a make-or-break moment. God isn't just their rescuer anymore. He's now their king, living right in the middle of their camp. Now in the ancient Near East, things like gods, temples, and sacrifices weren't new ideas. But God takes these familiar forms and completely flips them on their head. Unlike the pagan rituals of their neighbors, which were often about appeasing angry and unpredictable gods, Israel's worship was totally different. It was focused on a single, holy, and ethical God. It was a system that demanded they reject the horrific practices of surrounding cultures, like child sacrifice and ritual sex. Instead, it was designed to teach Israel about God's character and their unique identity as His people. And this gets us to the absolute core of the book, God's holiness. The word holy is the key word in Leviticus, showing up nearly 100 times. It means to be set apart or unique. In the Bible, God is uniquely holy because He's the creator of all life, perfect in goodness and justice. The best way to think about God's holiness is to picture the sun. The sun is the source of all life, warmth, and light on earth. It's fundamentally good, but if you get too close to it without protection, that same life-giving power will incinerate you. God's holiness is a lot like that. It's pure goodness and life, but its raw power is dangerous for anything sinful or corrupt. And Israel had just proven how sinful they were with that whole golden calf disaster in Exodus. So, Leviticus answers the question, how can these people approach the life-giving sun without being consumed? The entire book is God's gracious provision of the protective gear. Like a spiritual hazmat suit, they need to live safely in His glorious and dangerous presence. So how does God solve this problem? Part 1 of the answers laid out in the first 7 chapters, the sacrificial system. It's easy for us to be put off by all the blood and ritual, but these sacrifices were not a way for people to earn God's favor. They were a gift from God, a physical way for the Israelites to express key parts of their relationship with Him. Think of them as a kind of relational language. There were 5 main types of offerings. 2 of the offerings were basically about saying thank you, like bringing a gift to a dinner party to honor your host. The grain offering was a gift of flour and oil, a way of recognizing that all their provision came from God. The peace offering, also called the fellowship offering, was a shared meal between the worshiper, the priest, and God, symbolizing that everyone was in harmony. The other 3 offerings were about saying, I'm sorry. The sin offering was for unintentional sins that broke God's commands and contaminated the holy space of the tabernacle. The guilt offering was for sins that required payback, like if someone ripped off their neighbor. This one was like a court-ordered restitution. It required not only a sacrifice but also that the person repay what they stole, plus an extra 20%. But the most significant was the burnt offering. Here, the entire animal was consumed on the altar. It represented the worshippers' total surrender and dedication to God. In all of these atoning sacrifices, a crucial action took place. The worshipper would lay their hands on the head of the animal, symbolically transferring their sin and guilt onto it. The animal was then killed in their place. This all points to one of the most pivotal verses in the whole book, Leviticus 17:11. For the life of a creature is in the blood. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. This idea of substitution, an innocent life paying the price for guilt, was a constant, powerful reminder of both the seriousness of sin and the incredible grace of God. Now that we've looked at the what, the sacrifices, Leviticus moves to the who. Who could possibly stand in the gap between a holy God and a sinful people? Chapters 8 through 10 introduce us to the priesthood. God sets apart Aaron, Moses' brother, and his sons to serve as Israel's priests. They go through this elaborate 7-day ordination ceremony where they are washed, dressed in special clothes, and anointed with oil, setting them apart for their holy job. They were to be the mediators, representing the people to God and God to the people. You could think of them as spiritual electricians or even electrical transformers, tasked with carefully handling the immense, dangerous power of God's holiness so that the community could safely benefit from it. But this section also includes a terrifying story that shows just how high the stakes were. Aaron's 2 oldest sons, Nadab and Abihu, decided to just barge into God's presence on their own terms. They brought what the Bible calls unauthorized fire, ignoring God's specific commands. The response was immediate and devastating. Fire flashed out from God's presence and consumed them. This shocking event was a stark lesson for everyone. You don't just casually approach a holy God, it has to be on His terms, with reverence and humility. God's holiness isn't a tame, manageable force, it's wild and powerful. The priests weren't just guys in fancy robes, they were guardians standing on a dangerous yet life-giving frontier. This next section is probably the one that feels most bizarre to us today. Chapters 11 through 15 lay out all the laws of purity and impurity, or clean and unclean. These chapters cover everything from which animals you can and can't eat, to rules about skin diseases, moldy houses, and bodily discharges. It's tempting to just write these off as primitive hygiene laws, but they were so much more than that. These rules weren't really about physical health, they were symbolic. The best analogy is a spiritual dress code. To enter a highly sensitive environment like a hospital's operating room, you need to be sterile. Wearing muddy boots doesn't make you a bad person, it just makes you unfit for that specific environment. In the same way, these laws defined what made someone ritually fit to enter God's sacred space. Clean and unclean didn't mean sinful or sinless. It was about being ritually ready to be near God's presence. Certain things associated with death or decay made a person unclean, temporarily unable to go to the tabernacle. For instance, touching a corpse made you unclean because God is the author of life. A skin disease that looked like leprosy, which was seen as a kind of living death, also made you unclean. The dietary laws did the same thing. By only eating certain animals, Israel was constantly reminded that they were a set-apart people. These daily choices about food, health, and their bodies were constant physical reminders of a spiritual truth. To live with a holy God, Israel had to be a holy people, different from the world around them, and dedicated to the God of life and order. And right at the very heart of Leviticus, both in its structure and its theology, is chapter 16, the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. This was the most sacred day of the year. It was the one day when the high priest, and only the high priest, could pass through the curtain into the Holy of Holies, the most sacred space where God's presence dwelled. The ritual of this day perfectly illustrates the book's main themes. First, the high priest had to offer sacrifices for his own sins and the sins of his family, because even the mediator needed to be made right with God. Then, he would take 2 goats for the whole nation. The first goat was sacrificed for sin. Its blood was carried into the Holy of Holies and sprinkled on the Ark of the Covenant. This act symbolically cleaned the tabernacle itself from the spiritual contamination of Israel's sin, which allowed God to continue living among them. The second goat is the one we've all heard of, the scapegoat. The high priest would lay his hands on its head, confessing every sin and rebellion of the people of Israel, symbolically placing all of it onto the animal. But this goat wasn't killed. Instead, it was led far out into the wilderness and released, never to return. This was a powerful, visual demonstration of sin being completely removed. It's like the nation's spiritual hard drive was wiped clean. As the people watched that goat disappear over the horizon, They saw their sins being carried away, removed from the community and from God's sight. The Day of Atonement was the ultimate expression of how God dealt with the nation's collective guilt, cleansing them and resetting their relationship with Him for another year. If the first half of Leviticus is about how to worship a holy God in the tabernacle, the second half is about how to live as a holy people out in the world. Chapters 17 through 26 are often called the Holiness Code, and they take the idea of holiness and apply it to every corner of daily life. The main command, repeated over and over, is clear: be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. This shows us that holiness isn't just about ritual. If the rituals were like learning the basic grammar of holiness, the Holiness Code is about using that grammar to live out a beautiful story of justice and love. These chapters have laws for all parts of society. There are laws promoting social justice, telling the Israelites to care for the poor, the immigrant, and the worker. Landowners were told not to harvest the corners of their fields, leaving the leftovers for the needy. There are laws about economic justice, like the sabbatical and jubilee years, a radical system designed to prevent long-term poverty by returning land to its original family and forgiving all debts every 50 years. There are laws about sexual ethics, promoting integrity and healthy families, and right in the middle of all these practical everyday rules we find one of the most famous commands in the entire Bible: love your neighbor as yourself. This wasn't given in a vacuum. It's the peak of a chapter full of instructions on how to treat other people with fairness and dignity. For Leviticus, loving your neighbor is what it looks like to be a holy people, set apart for a holy God. The book wraps up with chapter 27, a chapter all about making vows to God. It lays out rules for when Israelites wanted to voluntarily dedicate people, animals, or property to the Lord. It gives a structured way for people to show their personal devotion and gratitude, making sure that even these spontaneous acts of faith were done with integrity. It's a final reminder that a relationship with God involves all of you, your worship, your ethics, and your personal promises. So let's go back to the problem we started with: Moses, standing outside the tabernacle, unable to enter God's glorious presence. The book of Leviticus is God's answer, and it works. The very first line of the next book, Numbers, reads, "The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent." The problem is solved. The system of sacrifice, priesthood, and purity laws created a pathway for a holy God to live peacefully among His people. So you see, Leviticus isn't some dusty, irrelevant rulebook. It's a profound theological statement. It teaches us about the stunning holiness of God, the devastating reality of sin, and the incredible grace of a God who makes a relationship possible. It shows that God cares not just about our spiritual lives, but about social justice, economic fairness, and our personal integrity. For Christians, the themes of Leviticus hit with even greater depth. The New Testament presents Jesus Christ as the ultimate fulfillment of everything Leviticus was pointing toward. It's like Leviticus was the complex architectural blueprint for a bridge to span the impossible gap between God and humanity. Jesus is the finished bridge. He is the perfect sacrifice, offered once for all sins. He is the great high priest, the perfect mediator between God and humanity. He is the one who truly makes us clean from our sin, and He is the perfect embodiment of God's holiness. Leviticus laid the groundwork, creating a vocabulary of ideas, substitution, atonement, holiness, that we absolutely need to understand the life and work of Jesus. Leviticus is a challenging book, no doubt, but it's also an incredibly rich one. It invites us to take God's holiness seriously, and to just marvel at the depth of His grace in making a way for us to live with Him. If you found this deep dive helpful, be sure to subscribe for more content that brings the Bible to life. We have a lot more to explore. You can also check out our website for study guides and other resources to help you go even deeper into these topics. And be sure to watch our video on the Book of Numbers to see what happens next in Israel's incredible journey. Thanks for watching.